The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Westmarch Palace, as Captain Marcus Thornfield adjusted his ceremonial sword and prepared for what would become the most challenging day of his 20-year career as head of the Royal Guard. The palace buzzed with its usual activity, servants moving quietly through corridors, preparing for another day in the life of the royal family. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Crown Prince Alexander, barely 12 years old, sat in the Grand Library, his small hands trembling as he turned the pages of a history book he wasn't really reading. The events of the previous evening played repeatedly in his mind like a terrible nightmare he couldn't escape. He had witnessed something that no child should ever see, something that could destroy everything his family had worked to build over generations. The young prince had always been curious, perhaps too curious for his own good. His tutors often remarked on his intelligence and his tendency to explore areas of the palace that were meant to remain private. It was this very curiosity that had led him to discover a hidden passage behind the ancient tapestry in the East Wing, a passage that connected several rooms and allowed him to move through parts of the palace undetected. The night before, unable to sleep due to a thunderstorm that rattled the windows, Alexander had decided to explore. He had taken his favorite flashlight and ventured into the passage, intending to reach the kitchen for a late-night snack. But as he made his way through the narrow corridor, he heard voices coming from Queen Consort Isabella's private chambers. The conversation was heated, and something about the tone made him pause and listen. What he heard would haunt him forever. Queen Consort Isabella, who had married his father King William just 3 years ago, was speaking in hushed but urgent tones with someone Alexander couldn't identify. They were discussing documents, bank accounts, and what sounded like plans to transfer vast sums of money from the royal treasury to private accounts abroad. But worse than the discussion of money was what came next. Isabella spoke of her growing impatience with waiting for King William to pass away naturally. She mentioned a contact who could provide certain substances that would accelerate the process, making it appear as though the king had died of natural causes related to his recent heart condition. Alexander's blood ran cold as he realized he was listening to his stepmother plan his father's murder. The young prince pressed himself against the wall of the passage, hardly daring to breathe. Through a small gap in the stonework, he could see into the room. Queen Consort Isabella sat at her ornate desk, speaking to a tall man in a dark coat, whom Alexander didn't recognize. The man's face was partially obscured, but his voice was deep and carried a foreign accent that Alexander couldn't place. "The timing must be perfect," Isabella said, her voice taking on a cold, calculated tone that Alexander had never heard before. "The king's physician has already documented his heart problems. A sudden cardiac event would surprise no one, especially given the stress he's been under with the recent political tensions." The stranger nodded, pulling out a small vial filled with clear liquid. "This will ensure it appears completely natural. No trace will remain after 48 hours. But you must be certain this is what you want. Once we proceed, there will be no turning back." Isabella took the vial, examining it in the lamplight. "I've waited long enough. William was useful for legitimizing my position, but now he's becoming a liability. His son will be easy enough to manipulate once I'm regent. By the time Alexander comes of age, I'll have consolidated enough power to ensure my own security." Alexander felt sick to his stomach. Not only was his stepmother planning to kill his father, but she was also planning to use him as a puppet to maintain her control over the kingdom. He wanted to burst into the room, to confront her, to protect his father, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the sheer shock of what he was witnessing, or perhaps some deeper instinct told him that he was not equipped to handle this situation alone. The conversation continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Isabella and the stranger discussed timing, methods, and alibis. They spoke of making it appear as though the king had suffered a heart attack during his sleep, perhaps after a particularly stressful day of royal duties. They even discussed how Isabella would react, how she would play the grieving widow to perfection. Finally, the stranger left through a secret door that Alexander had never known existed. Isabella remained at her desk, studying papers that Alexander couldn't see clearly. After what felt like an eternity, she extinguished the lamp and retired to her bedroom. Alexander waited in the darkness of the passage for another hour before finally creeping back to his own room. Sleep was impossible. Alexander lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what he had witnessed. Part of him wondered if it had been a nightmare, but the detail and clarity of the conversation convinced him otherwise. He thought about telling his father immediately, but what proof did he have? Would anyone believe a 12-year-old boy making such serious accusations against the queen consort? And what if Isabella discovered that he had overheard her plans? Would she decide that he too was a threat that needed to be eliminated? As dawn approached, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't handle this alone, but he also couldn't risk telling his father without solid evidence. There was one person in the palace whom he trusted completely, someone who had served his family with unwavering loyalty, and who might know how to handle such a delicate and dangerous situation. He would tell Captain Marcus Thornfield. Captain Thornfield had been like a second father to Alexander since his mother's death when he was 7 years old. The captain had taught him sword work, shared stories of his military adventures, and had always been someone Alexander could confide in when palace life became overwhelming. If anyone would know what to do, it would be Captain Thornfield. The morning seemed to drag on forever as Alexander waited for an appropriate time to approach the captain. He attended his morning lessons with his tutors, but his mind was elsewhere. His Latin tutor commented on his lack of focus, and his mathematics instructor had to repeat questions several times before getting responses. By the time his lessons ended, Alexander was desperate to unburden himself of the terrible secret he carried. Captain Thornfield was conducting his daily inspection of the guard when Alexander found him in the palace courtyard. The captain was examining the brass buttons on a young guardsman's uniform when he noticed the prince approaching. Something in the boy's expression immediately caught his attention. In his years of service, Thornfield had learned to read people, and what he saw in Prince Alexander's face was unmistakable fear. "Your Highness," Thornfield said, dismissing the guardsman with a nod, "you look troubled. Is everything all right?" Alexander glanced around the courtyard, noting the presence of several guards and palace staff. "Captain, could we speak privately?" "It's very important." Thornfield's concern deepened. "Of course, Your Highness. My office?" They walked in silence to Thornfield's office, a modest room in the palace's administrative wing. The walls were lined with maps, duty rosters, and commendations from Thornfield's military service. Alexander had always felt safe in this room, but today, even here, he felt vulnerable and exposed. Once the door was closed, Thornfield sat down across from Alexander. "Now then, what's troubling you?" Alexander took a deep breath, gathering his courage. What he was about to say would change everything, and there would be no taking it back. "Captain, last night I overheard something terrible. Something about Queen Consort Isabella." Thornfield's expression grew serious. "Go on." As Alexander recounted the conversation he had witnessed, he watched Thornfield's face change from concern to shock to grim determination. The captain asked careful questions, wanting to understand every detail of what the prince had seen and heard. He made no judgments about Alexander's decision to eavesdrop, understanding that the boy's curiosity had accidentally uncovered something far more serious than a mere breach of privacy. When Alexander finished his account, Thornfield sat in silence for several minutes, processing the information. Finally, he spoke. "Your Highness, what you've told me is extremely serious. If true, it represents not just a threat to your father's life, but to the stability of the entire kingdom." "Do you believe me?" Alexander asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I've known you since you were 7 years old," Thornfield replied. "You've never lied to me, not once. You're intelligent, observant, and despite your youth, you understand the gravity of what you're telling me." "Yes, I believe you." The relief Alexander felt at being believed was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety about what would happen next. What do we do now? How do we protect my father? Thornfield stood and began pacing, his mind racing through possibilities and procedures. "We need evidence, and we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Queen Consort Isabella is in a position of tremendous power and influence. If we make accusations without solid proof, she could easily turn the situation against us. But what if she tries to poison my father tonight? What if we're already too late?" "We won't let that happen," Thornfield said firmly. "I'm going to increase security around your father immediately, but I'll do it in a way that doesn't raise suspicion. I'll tell him there have been some general security concerns that require additional precautions. Alexander felt some of his panic subsiding. Having Captain Thornfield involved made everything seem more manageable, but the weight of the secret still pressed down on him. Should we tell my father what I heard? Not yet, Thornfield said after consideration. Your father loves Isabella deeply. Learning that she's planning to murder him would devastate him, and without concrete evidence, he might not believe it. Worse, if he confronted her about it, she might accelerate her plans or find another way to achieve her goals. The captain moved to his desk and pulled out a secure phone. I'm going to contact some trusted allies outside the palace. There are people who can help us investigate Isabella's background and her activities without alerting her to our suspicions. As Thornfield made his calls, Alexander sat in the chair, feeling both relief and terror. Relief that he was no longer carrying this burden alone, but terror at the implications of what they were dealing with. His stepmother, the woman who had comforted him after nightmares and attended his school plays, was planning to murder his father and manipulate him for her own gain. The afternoon passed in a blur of careful planning and discreet preparations. Thornfield arranged for additional guards to be stationed near the king's quarters, citing routine security updates. He also began making discreet inquiries about Queen Consort Isabella's activities and associations, reaching out to contacts in the intelligence community who could investigate without raising official red flags. Meanwhile, Alexander struggled to behave normally around Isabella during their evening meal. She seemed exactly as she always had, asking about his studies, commenting on palace affairs, and showing what appeared to be genuine affection for both Alexander and his father. The disconnect between this caring stepmother and the cold, calculating woman he had overheard the night before was almost impossible to reconcile. King William seemed tired during dinner, mentioning that he had been feeling some chest tightness earlier in the day. Isabella was immediately concerned, suggesting that he see the royal physician and perhaps take a few days of rest. Her performance was so convincing that Alexander almost doubted what he had heard. Could someone really be such a skilled actress? Could the woman who was now gently insisting that his father take his heart medication really be planning his murder? After dinner, as the royal family retired to their respective quarters, Alexander felt the full weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow, he and Captain Thornfield would begin their investigation in earnest. But tonight he would lie awake wondering if his father would survive until morning. The palace settled into its nighttime routine, but for Alexander and Captain Thornfield, the real work was just beginning. In his office, Thornfield reviewed security protocols and communication systems, ensuring that any attempt on the king's life would be immediately detected and prevented. He had already briefed his most trusted guards about the increased security measures, though he had not shared the specific nature of the threat. As the night deepened, both Alexander and Thornfield remained vigilant, knowing that they were the only barrier between the king and a carefully planned murder. The next few days would determine not just the fate of King William, but the future of the entire kingdom. The investigation into Queen Consort Isabella's background began at dawn the next day, though to anyone observing the palace routine, everything appeared perfectly normal. Captain Thornfield had spent the night coordinating with his external contacts, setting in motion a carefully orchestrated plan to uncover the truth about the woman who had become the second most powerful person in the kingdom. Alexander struggled through his morning lessons, his mind constantly wandering to thoughts of his father's safety and the investigation that was now underway. Every time he saw Isabella moving through the palace corridors, greeting staff members with her characteristic warmth and grace, he felt a chill run down his spine. The woman who smiled at the kitchen staff and inquired about their families was the same person who had calmly discussed the best methods for murdering her husband. During his fencing lesson with Master Garrett, Alexander's concentration was so poor that he barely managed to defend himself against even basic attacks. Master Garrett, a patient man who had taught swordsmanship to 3 generations of the royal family, finally called a halt to the session. "Your Highness, your mind is clearly elsewhere today," Master Garrett observed, setting down his practice sword. "Perhaps we should postpone this lesson until you're feeling more focused." Alexander nodded gratefully, eager to escape the lesson and find Captain Thornfield. As he made his way through the palace corridors, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Isabella was walking toward the king's study, carrying a silver tea service. It was unusual for the queen consort to personally deliver refreshments to the king. Such tasks were typically handled by the household staff. Fighting the urge to run, Alexander quickened his pace toward Captain Thornfield's office. He found the captain hunched over his desk, speaking in low tones on his secure phone. When Thornfield saw Alexander's expression, he immediately ended his call. "What's wrong?" Thornfield asked. "Isabella is taking tea to my father personally," Alexander said breathlessly. "She never does that. What if this is when she plans to use the poison?" Thornfield's expression darkened. "Where are they now? I saw her heading toward his study about 5 minutes ago." Without another word, Thornfield strapped on his sword and headed for the door. "Stay here," he commanded. But Alexander was already following him. "I'm coming with you," Alexander declared, his young voice carrying a determination that reminded Thornfield of the boy's mother. They made their way quickly, but quietly through the palace corridors, not wanting to appear as though they were responding to an emergency. As they approached the king's study, they could hear voices from within. The king's deep baritone and Isabella's melodic tones engaged in what sounded like pleasant conversation. Thornfield positioned himself outside the door, while Alexander crept closer to listen. Through the heavy oak door, they could hear Isabella encouraging the king to drink his tea while it was still warm. She spoke of how tired he had seemed recently, how important it was for him to take care of his health, how much the kingdom needed him to remain strong. Alexander's heart pounded as he realized this might be the moment when Isabella would administer the poison. He looked desperately at Captain Thornfield, who seemed to be calculating their options. They couldn't burst in without solid evidence. Such an action would be seen as treason if they were wrong. But they also couldn't stand by and watch if the king was about to be murdered. The decision was made for them when they heard a sudden commotion from within the study. The king's voice, previously calm and conversational, suddenly became strained and alarmed. They heard the crash of china hitting the floor and Isabella's voice rising in what sounded like genuine panic. Thornfield didn't hesitate. He burst through the door with Alexander close behind, ready to face whatever they might find inside. What they discovered was not what either of them had expected. King William was standing behind his desk, very much alive and unharmed, but his face was flushed with anger. Isabella was backing away from him, her face pale and her hands shaking. The tea service lay scattered across the floor, brown liquid soaking into the Persian rug. But most shocking of all was the presence of a fourth person in the room, the same tall man in the dark coat that Alexander had seen with Isabella the night before. "Captain Thornfield," King William said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Perfect timing. I believe we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." The stranger moved toward the window as if preparing to escape, but Thornfield was already blocking that route, his hand on his sword hilt. "Nobody moves!" Thornfield commanded with the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Alexander stared at the scene, trying to understand what had happened. His father was safe, but the tension in the room was explosive. Isabella looked terrified, but whether from being discovered or from some other cause was unclear. "Father," Alexander began, but King William held up a hand to silence him. "Alexander, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say," the king said, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "Your stepmother has just made a very serious mistake. She attempted to drug my tea, but fortunately, I've been aware of her activities for longer than she realizes." Isabella's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. "William, I can explain." "Explain?" King William's voice rose. "Explain how you've been planning to murder me. Explain how you've been embezzling funds from the royal treasury. Explain how you've been working with foreign agents to destabilize our kingdom." Alexander felt as though the world was spinning around him. His father knew about Isabella's plans. But how long had he known? And who was the stranger in the dark coat? As if reading his thoughts, King William continued, "Son, for the past 6 months, our intelligence services have been investigating suspicious activities connected to certain members of the court. When evidence began pointing toward Isabella, I made the difficult decision to allow the investigation to continue while taking precautions for my own safety." Thornfield stepped forward. "Your Majesty, There's something you should know. Prince Alexander overheard a conversation between the queen consort and this man last night. The prince came to me this morning with detailed information about a planned assassination attempt. King William looked at his son with a mixture of pride and sadness. Is this true, Alexander? Alexander nodded, finding his voice. I heard them talking about poisoning you and making it look like a heart attack. I was so scared, father. I didn't know what to do. The king moved around his desk and knelt before his son, placing his hands on Alexander's shoulders. You did exactly the right thing, my boy. Coming to Captain Thornfield was very brave and very smart. Isabella, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. You don't understand any of this. The situation is far more complicated than you realize. Enlighten us, King William said coldly, rising to face her. Isabella looked at the stranger, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. I never intended to hurt you, William, but there are forces at work here that are bigger than our personal relationship. The kingdom is in danger, and sacrifices must be made to protect it. What kind of danger? Thornfield demanded. The stranger finally spoke, his accented voice filling the room. The kind of danger that comes when neighboring kingdoms decide that Westmarch has become too prosperous, too influential. There are alliances being formed, armies being gathered, plans being made to invade and conquer this kingdom. Alexander felt confused. But that doesn't explain why you were planning to kill my father. Isabella's expression became desperate. Because your father would never agree to the compromises necessary to avoid war. He's too honorable, too stubborn. He would rather see the kingdom destroyed in battle than surrender even an inch of sovereignty. And you believed that murdering me and ruling through my son would be preferable? King William's voice was dangerously quiet. I believed that a regency would provide more flexibility in negotiations, Isabella replied. A child king, guided by advisors who understand the realities of international politics, could make concessions that would preserve the essential elements of the kingdom while avoiding a devastating war. The stranger stepped forward. Your Majesty, my government has been attempting to negotiate with you through unofficial channels for months. Every overture has been rejected. War is now virtually inevitable unless dramatic action is taken. Your government, Thornfield repeated. Which government would that be? The Republic of Valdoria, the stranger replied. I am Colonel Victor Petrov, special envoy for matters of regional security. It was a neighboring country that had been expanding its influence in the region for several years. His tutors had mentioned growing tensions between Valdoria and several smaller kingdoms, but he had never imagined that his own kingdom was under threat. King William's expression hardened further. So Isabella has been working as a Valdorian agent. How long has this been going on? Isabella's composure finally cracked completely. Since before we were married, she whispered. I was sent here to gather intelligence and, if necessary, to influence policy decisions. But William, I want you to know that my feelings for you became genuine. The original mission became secondary to my desire to build a real life here, until your handlers decided that more direct action was needed, Thornfield observed. Colonel Petrov nodded. The situation has escalated beyond what any of us anticipated. Valdoria is now part of a larger alliance that is committed to reshaping the political landscape of this entire region. Kingdoms that cannot be brought into the alliance through negotiation will be conquered. Alexander looked at his father, trying to gauge his reaction to these revelations. King William appeared calm, but Alexander had learned to recognize the signs of his father's deepest anger, the slight tightening around his eyes, the careful control of his voice. And you believed, King William said slowly, that murdering me and manipulating my son would somehow serve the interests of peace? We believed it would prevent a war that would cost thousands of lives, Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. Valdoria's alliance is too strong to resist. Your kingdom will fall whether you fight or not. The only question is how many people will die in the process. That choice should be made by the people of this kingdom and their legitimate ruler, Alexander said, surprising everyone in the room with the steel in his young voice. Not by traitors and foreign agents. Colonel Petrov studied Alexander with newfound interest. You speak wisely for one so young, Your Highness. Perhaps you would be more pragmatic than your father when you come of age. Perhaps, Alexander replied, but you'll never have the chance to find out through treachery and murder. The tension in the room was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Thornfield moved to the door and spoke briefly with someone outside, then returned to the room. "Your Majesty, the palace is now secured. Additional guards are in position, and our intelligence team is ready to begin formal interrogation procedures." King William nodded. "Colonel Petrov, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and treason against the crown. You will be held pending formal charges and possible extradition proceedings." "And Isabella?" Thornfield asked quietly. The king looked at his wife with an expression of profound sadness. "Isabella will face trial for treason. Despite her claims about preventing war, conspiracy to murder the sovereign is a capital offense." Isabella stood slowly, her dignity intact despite her tears. "William, whatever happens to me, please remember that I did love you. That part was never part of the mission." As Thornfield moved to escort the prisoners from the room, Alexander remained close to his father's side. The revelation that his stepmother was a foreign agent had answered many questions, but it had also raised new and terrifying possibilities about the future of the kingdom. "Father," Alexander said once they were alone, "what happens now? If this alliance Colonel Petrov mentioned is real, how do we protect the kingdom?" King William put his arm around his son's shoulders. "We prepare for whatever comes, just as our ancestors did. We strengthen our defenses, reach out to our own allies, and make it clear that this kingdom will not be conquered easily. But are we strong enough to resist an alliance of multiple countries?" "Strength isn't just measured in armies and weapons," the king replied. "It's also measured in the loyalty of our people, the justice of our cause, and the courage to fight for what we believe in. Today, you showed that kind of courage by coming forward with dangerous information. That gives me great hope for the future." As the afternoon wore on, the full scope of Isabella's betrayal became clear. Intelligence agents discovered evidence of years of systematic espionage, including detailed reports on military capabilities, economic resources, and political vulnerabilities. Bank records revealed that substantial sums had indeed been transferred to foreign accounts, though whether for personal enrichment or operational funding remained unclear. The revelation that war might be imminent cast everything in a new light. What had begun as a domestic crisis involving a planned assassination had revealed a much larger threat to the kingdom's very survival. Captain Thornfield immediately began implementing enhanced security measures and coordinating with military commanders to assess the kingdom's readiness for potential conflict. Alexander found himself thrust into a more adult world than he had ever imagined. The events of the past 2 days had forced him to confront realities about politics, loyalty, and survival that most children never need to consider. But rather than being overwhelmed, he felt a growing sense of determination to prove himself worthy of the responsibilities that would someday be his. As evening approached, Alexander stood with his father on the palace balcony, looking out over the kingdom that they might soon have to defend with their lives. The peaceful scene below, farmers returning from their fields, children playing in village squares, merchants closing their shops, seemed almost surreal given what they now knew about the threats gathering beyond their borders. "Father," Alexander said quietly, "I want to help. Not just by reporting what I overhear, but really help. I want to learn everything I need to know to protect our people." King William smiled, and for the first time in days, it was a smile without shadows. "Then your education is about to become much more interesting, my son. Because protecting a kingdom requires skills they don't teach in ordinary lessons." The crisis was far from over. Indeed, it was only just beginning. But as father and son stood together in the gathering dusk, there was a sense that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with courage, wisdom, and an unshakable commitment to the welfare of their people. 3 weeks had passed since the arrest of Queen Consort Isabella and Colonel Petrov, and the kingdom of Westmarch had transformed from a peaceful realm into a nation preparing for war. The intelligence gathered during the interrogations had confirmed the worst fears about the Valdorian alliance, a coalition of 4 neighboring countries that had indeed been planning a coordinated invasion scheduled for the upcoming harvest season. Captain Marcus Thornfield stood in the palace's newly established war room, studying maps and troop deployment reports that painted a sobering picture of the kingdom's military situation. Despite their best efforts to prepare defenses and call up reserves, Westmarch would be significantly outnumbered when the invasion began. The element of surprise which the enemy had counted on was gone, but their numerical advantage remained formidable. Prince Alexander had become a constant presence in these strategic meetings, much to the surprise of seasoned military officers who had initially questioned the wisdom of including a 12-year-old in such serious discussions. However, the boy's sharp intelligence and unique perspective had already proven valuable on several occasions. His youth allowed him to ask questions that adults might consider too obvious, often leading to insights that the experienced commanders had overlooked. "The mountain passes here and here," Alexander said, pointing to the map with a precision that would have impressed his geography tutor. "They're narrow enough that a small force could hold them against a much larger army. But what about supplies? How would we keep troops fed and armed in such remote positions?" General Harrison, the kingdom's chief military strategist, nodded approvingly. "An excellent question, Your Highness. We've been working on establishing supply lines that utilize the old smugglers' routes through the mountains. Local guides who know these paths could prove invaluable." King William observed these exchanges with a mixture of pride and concern. His son was rising to the challenges before them with remarkable maturity. But the king couldn't help but feel sadness that Alexander's childhood was being cut short by these grave circumstances. The boy should have been worried about his studies and friends, not military tactics and national survival. The morning's briefing was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Edmund Blackwood, the kingdom's chief intelligence officer, carrying a leather portfolio that contained the latest reports from agents operating in neighboring countries. His expression was grave as he approached the table where the royal family and military leadership had gathered. "Your Majesty," Sir Edmund began, "we've received disturbing intelligence from our sources within the Valdorian Alliance. The invasion timeline has been moved up significantly. Instead of waiting for harvest season, they plan to begin their assault within the next 10 days. 10 days was barely enough time to complete the defensive preparations they had been working on for weeks. Worse, many of the kingdom's reserve forces were still traveling from distant provinces to their assigned positions." "What prompted this change in their schedule?" King William asked, though his tone suggested he might already suspect the answer. "It appears that Colonel Petrov's failure to return from his mission has convinced them that their plans have been compromised," Sir Edmund replied. "They've decided to attack before we can fully prepare our defenses." Captain Thornfield stepped forward. "Your Majesty, under these circumstances, we need to consider all available options. Our defensive strategy was based on having more time to prepare. With the timeline compressed, we may need to think about alternatives." "What kind of alternatives?" Alexander asked, though something in Thornfield's tone suggested he wouldn't like the answer. "Evacuation?" Thornfield said simply. "We could relocate the royal family and essential government personnel to allied kingdoms until we can organize a resistance movement or secure military assistance from larger powers." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander felt his face flush with indignation, and even before his father could respond, the young prince was speaking. "Absolutely not," Alexander declared with a force that surprised everyone in the room. "We don't abandon our people when they need us most. If we run away, what message does that send? That the royal family only cares about saving themselves?" King William looked at his son with approval. "Alexander speaks for both of us. Whatever happens, we face it here, with our people." General Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, while I admire the sentiment, we must consider practical realities. If the royal family is captured or killed, it could demoralize our forces and make organized resistance much more difficult. Then we make sure we're not captured or killed," Alexander said firmly. "Captain Thornfield, you've taught me that the best defense is sometimes a good offense. What if instead of just waiting for them to attack us, we take the fight to them?" The adults in the room exchanged glances. While they appreciated the prince's spirit, military strategy was considerably more complex than his youthful enthusiasm might suggest. However, Thornfield found himself intrigued by the boy's thinking. What did you have in mind, Your Highness?" Thornfield asked. Alexander moved to the large map that dominated the center of the room. "Look at their approach routes. They have to coordinate attacks from 4 different directions, which means they need extensive communication between their forces. What if we disrupted those communications? What if we made it impossible for them to coordinate their assault? Sir Edmund leaned forward with interest. Go on. Our spies know their communication methods, their meeting points, their supply lines, Alexander continued, growing more confident as he developed his idea. Instead of waiting passively for them to attack, we could launch surgical strikes against these key targets. Small, fast-moving teams could create enough chaos to disrupt their coordination without engaging in major battles we're not equipped to win. The room fell silent as the military leaders processed this suggestion. It was audacious, dangerous, and completely contrary to the defensive strategy they had been developing. But it was also creative and might actually work. The boy has a point, General Harrison admitted reluctantly. If we could prevent them from coordinating their attacks, they would essentially be fighting 4 separate battles instead of one overwhelming assault. It would require precise timing and exceptional courage from our special forces. Thornfield added. The teams conducting these raids would be operating deep in enemy territory with no possibility of reinforcement if things went wrong. King William studied the map, his mind working through the implications of his son's proposal. Sir Edmund, how quickly could we organize such operations? But, Your Majesty, this plan would put some of our best people at enormous risk. If the raids fail, we would lose valuable personnel just before the main assault begins. And if we don't try, Alexander interjected, we lose the kingdom. The debate continued for hours, with military experts analyzing every aspect of the proposed strategy. Maps were consulted, intelligence reports were reviewed, and contingency plans were developed. Gradually, a consensus emerged that while risky, the plan offered their best hope of surviving the coming invasion. As the meeting concluded, King William asked Alexander to remain behind, while the others departed to begin implementing their decisions. When they were alone, the king's expression became more personal, less regal. I got it out on the top of its Aetheri. You better see this campaign from him called Other Rims. Son, I want you to understand something important. The strategy we're about to implement was largely your idea. If it succeeds, you'll have saved the kingdom. If it fails, many good people will die, and our enemies will still invade. Alexander nodded solemnly. I understand, Father, but doing nothing guarantees failure. At least this way we're fighting for our survival instead of just waiting to be conquered. You sound very mature for 12 years old. The king observed. Sometimes I worry that these events are forcing you to grow up too quickly. Maybe, Alexander admitted. But if I'm going to be king someday, I need to learn how to make difficult decisions and live with the consequences. I'd rather learn by trying to save the kingdom than by watching it fall. Over the next 3 days, the palace became a hub of frenetic activity as teams of elite soldiers, intelligence agents, and local guides prepared for the most ambitious military operation in the kingdom's recent history. Alexander found himself involved in many of the planning sessions, his intimate knowledge of the palace's hidden passages and secret routes proving valuable for developing similar tactics for operations in enemy territory. Captain Thornfield took personal command of the most crucial mission, a strike against the main Valdorian command post where the Alliance's leaders were coordinating their invasion plans. Intelligence suggested that eliminating this command structure could create enough confusion to delay or disrupt the entire assault. On the evening before the raids were scheduled to begin, Alexander found Thornfield in the palace armory, meticulously checking his equipment. The captain looked up as the prince approached, noting the worry in the boy's eyes. Having second thoughts about the plan? Thornfield asked gently. Not about the plan, Alexander replied. About sending you on the most dangerous mission. What if something happens to you? You're like a father to me. I can't lose you too. Thornfield set down the weapon he had been inspecting and placed his hands on Alexander's shoulders. Your Highness, do you remember what I taught you about duty and honor? That sometimes protecting what we love requires risking what we value most, Alexander recited from memory. Exactly. This mission is my duty, just as being a good king will someday be yours. We both have to be willing to risk everything for the people who depend on us. Alexander nodded, though his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to return safely," Thornfield said. "And I promise that if something does happen to me, you'll continue to grow into the kind of king this kingdom deserves." The raids began at dawn the following day, with teams launching simultaneous strikes across a 100-mile front. Alexander spent the day in the palace communications center, monitoring reports as they came in from the various operations. The initial reports were encouraging. Several key targets had been successfully eliminated, and enemy communications appeared to be in chaos. But as the day progressed, the reports became more mixed. Some teams had completed their missions and were withdrawing successfully, while others had encountered unexpectedly heavy resistance. By afternoon, it became clear that Captain Thornfield's team had run into serious trouble. A last communication from Thornfield's unit had come at midday, reporting that they had successfully infiltrated the Valdorian command post and eliminated several key officers. But subsequent attempts to contact the team had failed, and reconnaissance flights had spotted large numbers of enemy troops converging on the area where Thornfield's team was operating. Alexander felt sick with worry and guilt. If something terrible had happened to Captain Thornfield, it would be the result of a plan that Alexander had proposed. The weight of command, the burden of making decisions that affected other people's lives, suddenly felt overwhelming. As evening approached with still no word from Thornfield's team, King William found his son sitting alone in the palace garden, staring at the sunset with an expression of profound sadness. "No news yet?" the king asked, sitting down beside Alexander on the stone bench. Alexander shook his head. "Father, what if I was wrong? What if the plan was foolish and I've gotten good people killed for nothing? Son, leadership requires making difficult decisions with incomplete information," King William said gently. "Every choice involves risk. The question isn't whether we might fail, but whether we're willing to try when the alternative is certain defeat." But Captain Thornfield knew the risks when he volunteered for this mission. The king interrupted. "He believed in the plan because he believed in you. Don't dishonor his courage by doubting yourself now." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. A young messenger appeared, breathless from his sprint across the palace grounds. "Prince Alexander," the messenger gasped. "Captain Thornfield's team has been spotted approaching the eastern gate. They're returning." Alexander leaped to his feet and ran toward the palace entrance, his father close behind. In the courtyard, they could see a group of figures approaching through the gathering dusk. As they drew closer, Alexander could make out Captain Thornfield's familiar silhouette, though he appeared to be supporting a wounded comrade. The reunion was emotional but brief. Thornfield's team had successfully completed their mission, though not without cost. 2 of his men had been wounded during their withdrawal, and they had been forced to take a circuitous route to avoid enemy patrols, but the intelligence they brought back was invaluable. "The command structure is in complete chaos," Thornfield reported as the team's wounds were tended. "We eliminated 3 of their top commanders and destroyed their main communications equipment. From what we observed, they're having to completely reorganize their invasion plans." Over the following days, reports from the other raiding teams painted a similar picture. The coordinated assault that the Valdorian alliance had planned was falling apart. Supply lines had been disrupted, communication networks were down, and the careful timing that would have allowed them to overwhelm Westmarch's defenses had been completely destroyed. When enemy forces finally did begin crossing Westmarch's borders, they came in disorganized groups rather than as part of a coordinated invasion. The kingdom's defenders, now fully prepared and positioned, were able to repel these piecemeal attacks with relative ease. What should have been a devastating conquest became a series of minor skirmishes that the invaders quickly abandoned. 3 months later, the Valdorian alliance formally requested peace negotiations. The failed invasion had cost them significant resources and revealed weaknesses in their own territories that other enemies were beginning to exploit. What had begun as an attempt to expand their influence had ended up weakening their position in the region. Alexander stood once again on the palace balcony, but this time he was looking out over a kingdom at peace. The crisis had passed, and the immediate threats to Westmarch's independence had been neutralized. But the experience had changed him in ways that would influence the rest of his life. Captain Thornfield joined him on the balcony, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, a treat they had shared since Alexander was very young. Any regrets about how things turned out? Thornfield asked, handing one cup to the prince. Alexander considered the question carefully. I regret that people had to die. I regret that we couldn't find a peaceful solution, but I don't regret fighting for our freedom. And Isabella? Any regrets about exposing her plans? This question required even more thought. I feel sorry for her, Alexander said finally. I think she genuinely believed she was preventing a worse outcome. But she was wrong to think that betraying us was the answer. Trust, once broken, can never be completely repaired. Thornfield nodded approvingly. Those are the thoughts of a future king who understands both justice and mercy. As the sun set over the peaceful kingdom, Alexander reflected on the lessons he had learned during the crisis. He had discovered that leadership required courage, but also wisdom. That protecting others sometimes meant taking risks that could result in personal loss. That the weight of command was heavier than any crown. Most importantly, he had learned that being a king wasn't just about wearing robes and attending ceremonies. It was about being willing to sacrifice everything for the welfare of others, about making impossible decisions when there were no perfect choices, and about inspiring others to be braver and better than they thought possible. The boy who had accidentally overheard a treasonous conversation had become a young man ready to shoulder the responsibilities of leadership. The kingdom was safe, but Alexander knew that greater challenges would come in the future. When they did, he would be ready to face them with the courage, wisdom, and dedication that his people deserved. In the end, the real victory wasn't just the defeat of the invasion or the exposure of the conspiracy. The real victory was the transformation of a curious child into a future king, who understood that true power came not from commanding others, but from serving them with unwavering loyalty and love.